Okay, so what we've seen so far is that there are various multifactorial models that explain sexual offending. The vast majority of these, though, are focused around the idea of looking at child sexual abuse as a form of sexual offending. And obviously, we know that there are other forms of sexual offending, rape being probably the most high profile of these. Now, what I'm going to show you now are two kind of frameworks. They're not really theories, they're just ways of understanding rape from a kind of theoretical, philosophical sense, I suppose. So we're going to compare and contrast the sociological approach to understanding rape to the evolutionary approach to understanding rape. The standard social science model, or the standard social science explanation, is known colloquially as the feminist theory, and that is going to be in conflict, and it is in conflict with the evolutionary approach to understanding sexual violence. Now, just to give you an overview of what these two models or these two frameworks suggest, is that so the first one in relation to sociology and the feminist theory of rape, according to this model, rape is a tool of the patriarchy. So this idea of a kind of male-dominated society, the patriarchy, the idea here is that rape serves as a function to assert social dominance and to maintain social dominance. So rape is a way of essentially men maintaining their social power over women. This was probably most famously put forward or advanced by Susan Brown-Miller. There's various other people nowadays who are also pushing this kind of idea. So Julie Bindel, Jessica Taylor is another person who recently is pushing these kinds of ideas. But Brown-Miller was kind of pivotal in conceptualizing this in a kind of coherent and comprehensive way. What she said in her book Against Our Will back in 1975 was that rape is a process of intimidation by which all men keep all women in a state of fear. Now, I don't think that Brown-Miller was suggesting that all men are rapists or even potential rapists, but I think the conclusion here was that men have the potential for rape, and we know that this is the case in our legal context, in that it is only men who can be convicted of rape due to the wording of the law. But yeah, what I think is going on here is the idea that all men have the potential for rape, and therefore, while the potential for rape is there, women are potentially subjugated as a result of that. So according to this standard social science explanation of rape, rape is about patriarchy, social control, and social dominance. Now, contrastingly, the evolutionary approach to studying rape is more biologically based, more sexually based, I suppose. So while the standard social science explanation focuses on power and control, the evolutionary approach looks at the function of rape. So when we're talking about evolutionary arguments for any kind of behaviour or any evolutionary explanations for any kind of behaviour, really what we're looking at is the functional account. What function does rape serve? Because clearly it does have a function, because as a society we still see high levels of rape among kind of large proportions of society. So Randy Thornhill and Craig Palmer put together a book in the year 2000 looking at the evolutionary arguments for rape, and essentially what they were doing was they were trying to refute some of the more sociologically minded arguments, and they came up with two different approaches to understanding the potential function of rape. So the first one was that rape is an adaptive response. So it allows for the direct spread of genes from one generation to another. This is a very simplistic way of understanding evolutionary theory, and that it's all about passing on one's genes to the next generation. That said, this is one argument that is made in relation to the evolutionary approach to rape. A second argument, which is more of a nuanced, more sophisticated approach potentially, is that rape is a byproduct of evolutionary developments. And what this approach specifically does is it includes kind of some of the observations that we've learned about in the Warden Beach integrated theory. So we know that there are some men who are less able to compete on the mating market, possibly due to female sexual selection strategies, but also due to just their kind of lack of ability to compete with other men for viable mates. And the result of this is that a male desire to procreate is what's driving sexual aggression in these cases. So these guys are typically not being able to compete in a legitimate way for reproductive partners, so therefore they choose a different strategy, a different reproductive strategy, which involves sexual aggression, sexual coercion, and rape. Now, underpinning both of these arguments is that rape is fundamentally based in sexual instincts and reproductive drives. This is the key kind of differentiation between the social science or the sociological argument and the evolutionary argument. In the social science argument, everything is about power and control. In the evolutionary argument, everything is around kind of sexual instinct and sexual drive. Now, I'm making an assumption that most people will be adhering to the sociological approach. We're constantly kind of given these messages within the media and within society that rape is a crime of power and control. Now, that said, there is some, I think, potentially compelling evidence for an evolutionary argument. Or at least that rape has something to do with sex. So Jones in 1999 puts together a list of kind of criteria almost that you would expect to see ticked off as you were kind of seeing whether or not sex has something to do with the act of rape. Now, these things do tend to support what came later, which is The Natural History of Rape by Palmer and Thornhill. So what Jones suggested was that coerced copulation, or as we would call it rape, is common within the animal kingdom. It's a universal across different species, and it's a human universal as well. We see it in a range of different cultures, different contexts, different social environments, among different populations. And just by having these two facts side by side, that animals typically are using this as maybe a reproductive tool or a tool for power and control, and that it's present in almost all human populations, gives us an indication that it's something to do with our evolutionary history. Now, when we think about the context of rape and kind of what happens during rapes, then typically speaking, rapists do tend to use the least necessary force. So in a typical rape, what you'll see is that a perpetrator will use just as much force as they need to gain control or compliance from their victim. That suggests that the argument that rape is all about power and all about control and all about violence and domination isn't necessarily true. That doesn't mean that these things don't play a role, but the findings here do seem to suggest some kind of evolutionary approach, in that control is gained and then it's about the sex and then it's about the reproductive act. We also see that rape victims are typically of reproductive age, and that rapists are not demographically typical of the male population. What I mean by that is that rapists or people convicted of rape are typically demographically younger, or disproportionately from kind of the late teens up until the early 30s. What this means is that it's an indicator of intrasexual competition. As people get older, they get settled into their relationships. At a younger age, people are more likely to be competing for mates. And if we think about this idea of rape being a byproduct of maybe not being able to compete on that mating market, then it stands to reason, it makes logical sense that perpetrators of rape would be demographically younger, because they are more involved in that competition with other men. And victims of reproductive age typically report greater levels of stress and traumatization than older victims. Now, this isn't necessarily an argument for the evolutionary explanation for rape, but it does seem to suggest that there is an evolutionary argument for responses to rape as well. and that might be related to kind of anxiety about potential conception. Now, what I'm not suggesting here is that that rape is totally an evolutionary process, and I think that a constant kind of criticism that people get when they're trying to make these kinds of arguments, or when they're trying to formulate these kind of arguments, is that to understand rape in an evolutionary context, or to try and frame rape as an evolutionary process, is almost to condone it, to come up with some kind of biological deterministic explanation as to why someone did what they did. I would suggest that this isn't the case, and I think to formulate an explanation from a particular perspective is not to condone any particular behaviour. I think everyone has control over what they do and how they behave, but by negating a potential sexual motive or a potential sexual or reproductive explanation for rape, then we do a disservice to potential victims and actual victims of this type of offending. If you're interested in the juxtaposition between the sociological and the evolutionary approach, there's a nice chapter in The Blank Slate by Steven Pinker that you can pick up relatively cheaply on Amazon. Now, the reality obviously is that the true explanation for rape is somewhere in the middle of these. It's neither a purely sociological offence, and it's not a purely evolutionary offence either. There will be aspects of power and control within rape. There'll be aspects of sex in rape purely because it's a sexual offence. And I think this is the kind of core aspect of this debate that I think gets lost on many people. We try and split into camps. We have this very kind of Manichaean way of thinking about controversial topics. Are you on team sociology or are you on team evolution? And I think somewhere in the middle is where most people would like to be, and I think that's where the reality probably is. But hopefully in this video what you've learned is that there are different camps, and that to explain rape in evolutionary terms isn't necessarily to condone it. It's not to condone it at all, but it offers another way of understanding why some men may resort to sexual violence as a form of access to sexual mates.